Great. Welcome back. So the second session of Congress gets to the financial problems that have precipitated this whole constitutional crisis that we've been talking about. And by the end of 1789, Secretary Hamilton prepared a report on public credit. And there was something like $54 million in national debt, that is debt of the federal government of the United States. Another 25 million or so owed by the states. This was the debt incurred in fighting the Revolutionary War. That's where it came from. And about 60 million was owed to Americans, 10 million to foreigners, and Hamilton proposed having the United States assume, that is, agree to pay all of the state debt as a way of ensuring that the Revolutionary War debt was paid, and also so that creditors, that is those who were owed money, would have an allegiance to or an interest in the success of the federal government rather than the state government. So, brilliant financial idea, for the federal government to assume the state debt. What do you folks think of the idea? You like the idea, absolutely. Why do you like the idea?
Well, for the same reason you just listed, it creates a vested interest in the federal government succeeding, and also builds goodwill. Should build some goodwill in states.
It should, yeah. So definitely, it should. Some states actually don't like this because they've already paid their debt. For example, Virginia, which had a huge debt, and I told you a couple of weeks ago how Virginia had paid it off. And Pennsylvania also has paid off its debt, and now they're told, hey, you know what? We're also going to have to pay off the debts of Massachusetts and South Carolina, which have not paid off their debts. Of course, if you're from Massachusetts, you'll really like this idea because now our state debt's going to be paid by everyone else. Well, we'll be part of it too. So you can see how it's going to cause some friction. By the way, before I jumped in, does anyone not like the idea? Okay, so we're all from Massachusetts. We love the idea. Probably there are people watching at home who say, well, wait a minute. And I hope no one in the Massachusetts state government is watching and thinks, wow, that's a great idea. We didn't know we could do that. Don't tell them at the State House, okay? So another issue here. Should this debt, and we talked a couple of times ago about these state securities, these IOUs, which now are mainly in the hands of people who bought them from the original holders, should those be paid at face value or at market value? In the market, you can buy one of these 100-pound certificates maybe for 40 or 50 pounds. Should we then pay it at 100 pounds or should we pay it at market value? You say full value. Why?
That's what they bought. I think they would be really pissed.
They would, but what if they paid less than that? What if they paid 20 pounds for it? Now it's worth 40 pounds because we think it's going to get paid off, and now you say it's going to be actually worth 100 pounds. What about the guy who sold it to you for 20 pounds in the first place? Now you're going to get 100 pounds from this. Isn't he going to be really ticked, to paraphrase what you said for the folks at home? Peeved, maybe. I mean, you may be right, but you can see why there would be grounds for people saying that's really wrong, because now we're enriching a lot of fat cats who just bought this up because they had the capital.
But that's what the contract said to begin with.
That's what the contract said to begin with, of course. That's right. What's a contract good for? You are starting to convince me that maybe they should be paid at face value, although I know the kinds of people who have gotten their hands on these things, and I'm a little leery of this. Okay, so this is great. Okay, so we've decided then we're going to have the federal government pay off this debt, and we're going to pay it off at face value, not market value, which is great. How are we going to pay it? I forgot to mention the federal government doesn't actually have any money at this point.
Issuing more debt.
They should issue more debt. Good. I think I see a job in Washington for you. Does that really make sense? Faced with a crisis of credit, their only solution was to borrow more money. You remember where that's from? Franklin Roosevelt's first inaugural address, where he talks about the money changers driven from the temple of our civilization, so on. Anyway, okay, so you want to borrow more. Anyone else have a different suggestion? Hamilton proposes an excise tax. That is a tax on, let's suppose, an excise tax is an extra tax, an additional tax on something you have. Every year, surprisingly enough, in February, you get a bill for your car. You haven't done anything different with your car, but Massachusetts has an excise tax on cars, just because you have one. In England, this is actually how they fund the BBC, is an excise tax on radios and televisions. You pay a tax every year, and that's how they fund it. They don't have commercials. It's the method they prefer, and who are we to judge? Well, we have, I guess, been judging the English since the beginning of the semester, explaining how we had to get away from them. So we got away from them because of excise taxes. In fact, if you were paying attention in the 1690s, there were all these pamphlets attacking the excise tax as an instrument of tyranny, something the king would use to establish a standing army. And so odious and unpopular were excise taxes that in Federalist number 12, Alexander Hamilton had said, all of these folks saying we're going to have a government that's going to impose excise taxes are wrong because excise taxes are so politically unpopular, no Congress would ever be able to pass one. Okay, that was Federalist 12, which he wrote in the fall of 1787. In the fall of 1789, he says, you know what? We need an excise tax. The excise tax actually fails, and Hamilton actually says we're going to have to separate the way we pay the debt from the fact that we will pay the debt. We have to assume these state debts, but we will talk later about how to pay for it. Now, yes?
How can they justify an excise tax?
How?
Be like, oh, we need money?
Yeah, it's essentially the justification. We need money. Yeah. I think that's usually the justification for any tax is, either we need money or this particular habit you have, smoking or drinking, is bad for you, so we're going to tax it, and that will discourage you from doing it, plus it'll give us more money. So, I don't know. Do you want to, I don't want to point to you as our representative of state government, but say, how do they justify this? But it's one reason why you have elections for these people, so you can keep an eye on them. But you should ask your state rep next time you see him or her, how do you justify this? And they'll tell you, oh, don't you like schools and roads and things like that? And yes, sir.
Do we know, at the time that we're planning on paying these vouchers, what do you call them? What percentage of them were actually owned by war veterans?
Okay, that's a good question. How many of these IOUs were actually owned by veterans? Very few at this time. Okay, they're mostly owned by people who bought them up, seeing this as a good thing to speculate in. Okay. So Madison also thought maybe we should have some provision for paying the original holders something, but that doesn't really work either. Now, this whole contentious debate about assuming state debts, would have gone down had it not coincided with another big debate, where to put the capital. It's in New York, and Philadelphia wants it back. They said all that unpleasantness in 1783, bygones are bygones. And also Pennsylvania actually proposes a number of different places in Pennsylvania for it. And there's this group down in northern Virginia that thinks Georgetown in Maryland would be a good place for it. That had been a proposal floated in the mid-1780s. So you have this debate going on about where to put the capital, also this debate about the debt, and essentially what we do is work out a compromise. Virginia doesn't want to assume the state debts, but Virginia does want to have the capital on the Potomac, okay? Pennsylvania wants to assume the state debts, also wants to have the capital in Philadelphia, okay? So Pennsylvania actually was against it too. I'm sorry, take that back. Rewind the tape. have to correct myself. Okay, Pennsylvania does not want to assume the state debts, but does want the capital to be in Pennsylvania. And what Hamilton and actually Madison work out is a compromise. The capital will move to Philadelphia in 1791. In return, the congressman from Philadelphia, or some of the congressmen from Pennsylvania, will go along with assuming the debt. Something they don't want, in return they get something they do want. Virginia doesn't want to assume the debt, but Virginia does want to build a capital on the Potomac. So we'll accept the assumption of the state debt, and in return, in 1800, we get the capital. Of course, the Pennsylvanians think there's no chance that they're ever going to build a capital on the Potomac, so we actually get the better end of this deal. We didn't really want assumption, but we do want to get the capital. New York very much wants the state debts assumed by the federal government, so they're okay with having the capital leave New York. Very elaborate compromise which works out. The Congress agrees to the assumption of the debt, and the capital will move first to Philadelphia, then to this district being built, or which might be built somewhere in the swamps of Maryland and Virginia by 1800. Okay? So it's a political solution to what could have been a nasty and contentious political problem or constitutional problem. A real difference begins to emerge on this. Madison and Hamilton had worked together very well, and Jefferson and Madison, of course, were very close, but Jefferson and Hamilton never really hit it off. There's a story about Jefferson having a dinner party in New York when he's Secretary of State, and there he has this portrait he had done in Paris when he was the American minister there. And it's of the three greatest men who ever lived. And if you were Thomas Jefferson, who would you say are the three greatest men who ever lived? See, we're stumped. Not Plato, not Socrates. No, they're more modern, actually. No, not Rousseau. Locke is one. Okay. They're all English. Newton. And Bacon, okay? Sir Francis Bacon. Jefferson, I think you can see it at Monticello. Hamilton comes over for dinner and he asks the same question many of us would have. Who are these guys? And Jefferson says, well, they're the three greatest men who ever lived. Sir Francis Bacon, Sir Isaac Newton, and John Locke. And Hamilton says, the greatest man who ever lived was Julius Caesar. Jefferson doesn't have a great sense of humor, and things don't go well after that. There's also another story of Adams and Hamilton. And by the way, Jefferson and Hamilton clashed. Adams and Hamilton hated each other. There are lots of expressions Adams used to describe Hamilton, none of them which I can repeat before such a nice audience. So Adams was pontificating on the British Constitution, and he said if you could strip the British Constitution of corruption, it would be the greatest government in the world. And Hamilton said if you stripped the British Constitution of corruption, it wouldn't work. And he was right. You see grounds here for disagreement among these guys, and a real difference begins to emerge in 1790 when Hamilton sees, we have an $800,000 shortfall in federal revenues. We really need to have an excise tax now, and we'll put it on whiskey, a tax on whiskey, which means if you are a farmer in western Pennsylvania or in Kentucky, you're raising corn, you turn the corn into whiskey because whiskey is more marketable than corn, it's more transportable than corn. You can take, 20 bushels of corn and make a gallon of whiskey. That gallon of whiskey is worth more than the 20 bushels of corn, so shouldn't you tax this thing you have created out of 20 bushels of corn? You're right, we need the money for it, and this is something. You're going to market this, You're not going to drink all of the whiskey you are producing, so the federal government will put an excise tax on whiskey. This tax will fall most heavily on the frontier, and Hamilton reasons, look, we already have set tariffs on imported goods, so merchants in the cities are paying a tax to the federal government. These farmers out in western Pennsylvania, Kentucky, these other places are not. This will bind them to the federal government by having an excise tax on whiskey. And you will get this tax actually by, well, sending out inspectors to inspect the stills. Each farmer doesn't have a still. Usually there will be one guy with a still. He'll be turning all of his neighbors' corn into whiskey, and so then you can just tax his production, right? What do you think? Excise tax on whiskey is a way of paying the federal debt, the assumption of state debts, and will tax these yahoos who are producing whiskey, and they won't notice. They might rebel. Yeah. Actually, okay, because of there's that possibility, they actually hold off on imposing this tax. Okay? We're going to put the whiskey tax on hold for just a bit. First, Hamilton proposes maybe what we should also do to help our financial situation is create a national bank. Italy, Germany, Holland, England, France all have national banks. A national bank will augment the productive capital of the United States. You know, banks lend money. Banks mobilize capital. They're really useful engines for economic growth. If there's a national bank, the United States could borrow money from it, and also we could put treasury deposits in the national bank. This tariff revenue we're getting in. We can have one bank to put it in rather than trying to find a state bank that can handle all of this gold. It will also be able to circulate notes based on the value of whatever it has. This is another thing banks do. By the way, there is no paper currency in the United States, and there won't be until the Civil War. So the circulating currency will either be gold coins or silver coins or copper coins that the United States mints, or gold coins from Spain by way of Mexico, or Mexico by way of Spain, or Portuguese gold coins or Dutch gold coins, or British silver, the pound, pound sterling. It's actually a pound of something. So you have these different circulating media. Banks also issue notes, and the notes depreciate. So you have a note from the Bank of Boston. You then go to Philadelphia. The bank there will have a ledger telling them how much a note from the Bank of Boston for $100 is actually worth in Philadelphia. It's a very complicated thing. If you have a national bank, it can set a rate for all of these notes. It can have a note that then sets what the circulating medium is. And this will be a great thing. That if you have a national bank, it's going to simplify everything, make the economy run much more smoothly, give the federal government a better sense of how much is owed and how to pay it. So Hamilton proposes a national bank. He proposes that Congress should charter a bank for 20 years. It will have $10 million in capital, and it gets the capital by having shares, 25,000 shares that are sold for $400 each. And if you want to buy a share in the Bank of the United States, you'll have to pay $100 of this in either gold or silver. The rest can be paid in these public debt certificates. Okay? And the bank also can own up to $15 million in real or personal property. The shareholders, that is these guys who have bought the 25,000 shares, will choose a board of directors, a 25-member board of directors. And the bank, as I said, can issue bank notes payable on demand in gold and silver. Now, the United States can buy up to $2 million worth of shares. That is, the president can authorize the United States to buy shares in this bank up to $2 million worth, but two differences. The government will have to pay in hard currency, gold or silver. It can't pay government certificates to buy shares in the bank. That would be ridiculous. And also, the government won't get a dividend on the shares it has purchased. The reason you buy shares in any corporation is you hope to get a dividend. That's the incentive for you as an investor. Okay, do you like this idea?
The idea for the government not to get paid.
Well, the whole idea for the bank.
Yes, it's a good idea.
Okay.
Because it encourages, it actually helps promote the industry and the commerce.
Sure. Okay. I can see a value in a bank. Okay? Everyone else not see a value? Anyone here hate banks, by the way? Anyone here love banks? You're neutral about banks. Maybe their ads are actually paying off and you love the banks. Okay. It's interesting to track public moods about banks through teaching this class. Okay. James Madison is opposed to the bank. Not because he thinks, well, actually, a lot of farmers don't like banks because banks are the lending entity, and, well, we'll talk more about this, but Madison's real objection to this is as follows. The Constitution does not give Congress the power to charter corporations. Madison, in fact, remembered at the convention he had proposed giving Congress the power to charter corporations because he thought it would be useful to build canals, do other kinds of things. So if Congress had the power to do that, it would be a good thing. The convention had voted him down. So the Constitution does not give Congress this power. So yes, a bank might be useful, but Congress doesn't have the power to create one. What do you think of that argument? Yes.
If that cannot be, if Congress doesn't have power, then something should be created, some mechanism that would help to make these adjustments.
Yeah, there is actually a mechanism for that. It's called a constitutional amendment.
Yeah.
You could amend the Constitution to give Congress this power. Yes.
Wouldn't the counter-argument be that the Congress did have the right to foreign currency?
It can coin currency, yeah.
Well, how could it coin it without a bank, though?
It can coin it without a bank. It's doing it right now without a bank. In 1789, it's doing it without a bank. Yeah, they can set up. Well, they can coin. Okay, the Constitution says states cannot make anything but gold or silver legal tender in payment of debts. Okay, so and states can't coin money. Therefore, it's up to the federal government to coin money. No one else can do it. It doesn't say anything about having. You don't need a bank to do that. A bank might make it more useful or easy or convenient, but you can do it without a bank. Yes.
Why don't the government just go to some rich guy and convince him to start this bank?
Well, actually, that's what had happened. I mean, there were a couple of rich guys who had banks that were doing this. The problem there is sometimes these rich guys' banks fail, which is what happened to poor Robert Morris, one of this great financier. Bank fails, he loses everything. He's poor guy, Robert Morris, and what good is he? So that's the problem. One of the problems with banks. I used to be able to tell students, you're too young to remember this happening, but happily for me, we now know that banks can fail, whether they're too big to fail or not. So sadly for the economy and everyone else, but being a self-interested college professor, I only think about what's good in the lecture on banks. And, so yes. So Congress very easily passes this. Madison got up and said, Congress, we don't have the power to do this. Members of Congress don't really say, oh, gee, we can't? We better not do that then. They see this as a great thing. The senator from Pennsylvania, William Maclay, kept a diary, and Maclay is an avid opponent of the bank. And he sees that what these guys in Congress are doing is they're in a hurry to charter this thing because then they'll be first in line to buy stock in it. So he sees the spirit of speculation alive in Congress in 1790 as they're pushing through this bank. And Maclay hoped that the directors of the bank, these 25 individuals who are going to have great control over the economy of the country, would have more integrity than the members of Congress did. In the hands of bad men, it may be made a most mischievous engine. Indeed, so may any even of the best human institutions. Okay, so Congress had said, well, we don't care if we have power or not. We'd like a bank. However, President Washington knew that he had a constitutional responsibility not to sign laws that violated the Constitution. The president has a veto power. Washington did not believe the president should veto a law because he didn't like it or because he would have passed a different kind of law. The only reason Washington thought the president should veto a law is if the law violates the Constitution. And in fact, this was the prevailing idea of every president up to Andrew Jackson. And so Washington also, as a Virginia tobacco planter, disliked banks, didn't like banks for the reason farmers didn't like banks. But he saw that, and actually he's heard that in Philadelphia, the financial community there wanted to use the bank to prevent the bank with the United States. Congress is in Philadelphia when it's chartered. The bank is in Philadelphia, and Washington's afraid once the bank is there, the Philadelphia rich guys, to use your phrase, are going to hold on to the Capitol in Philadelphia and prevent it from moving to the Potomac, which is incidentally where Washington wants it to be. But he can't veto a law because it violates my self-interest or because I thought the law was bad. The only reason the president can veto a law is if the law violates the Constitution. So Washington asks his cabinet members for advice. Is this constitutional? And Attorney General Randolph says, anyone know what he says? He says, no, not constitutional. Thomas Jefferson also says it is not constitutional. First, he says Congress has no power to charter a bank. It does have a power to lay and collect taxes for the purpose of paying debts, but the bank bill doesn't actually lay and collect taxes, nor does it pay any debts. Congress does have the power to borrow money, and the argument for the bank bill was it'll make it easier to borrow money, but the bill doesn't borrow any money. It says that the bank can lend money to the federal government, but also it may not. And in fact, Jefferson says, under the bill, the United States is going to lend the bank $2 million and then borrow it back. So how is that borrowing money? We're actually giving the bank the money we're going to get back from it. He says, call it by what name you please. So the bank bill doesn't do the things which the Constitution says Congress can do, lay and collect taxes, borrow money. So there are specific powers of Congress, and it had been argued the bank bill fits under this, but Jefferson says actually it doesn't. And then there are some general powers of Congress. Article 1, Section 8, the General Welfare Clause, lay and collect taxes to promote the general welfare and provide for the common defense. Jefferson says you cannot interpret the General Welfare Clause broadly because that makes the rest of Article 1, Section 8 meaningless. Why would you have this thing here about, why would you have specific powers of Congress if the whole thing starts off by saying Congress can promote the general welfare of the United States? That's a very broad thing. Why would you have the specific meanings after it? And then necessary and proper. Congress, can borrow money, lay and collect taxes, and do anything else that's necessary and proper to carry the foregoing powers into effect. But what does necessary mean? Yes, we've made the argument that having a bank will make it easier to borrow money, make it easier to make sure that taxes are uniform throughout the country. But ease is different from necessity. Convenient is different from necessity. Bank bills may be a more convenient vehicle than Treasury orders. Right now when the federal government wants to buy something, the Treasury has to issue an order for it. With a bank, you could just, hand someone a bunch of notes. But a little difference in the degree of convenience cannot constitute the necessity which the Constitution makes the grounds for assuming any non-enumerated power. All other powers which are necessary and proper. He also says, yes, it would be more convenient to have a uniform medium circulating throughout the world, or throughout the country. It would be even more convenient if we had a bank that could circulate notes all over the world. But that doesn't mean anyone has the power to create such a bank. So this is the big argument: no specific power in the Constitution to charter a bank. Next, it infringes on state powers. States can charter banks. If the federal government does this, it's infringing on a power of the states, and this means the federal government will be able to do anything it wants, that, obliterating the states. And he says the Federalists had argued that all of the powers not given were reserved. So here is a power that was not given. That must mean the power to charter corporations is reserved to the states. So, reading Jefferson's message on the bank, President Washington thought, the bank is unconstitutional, therefore I will veto it. But before he did so, he showed Secretary Hamilton Jefferson's critique of the bank, and so Hamilton wrote a response to Jefferson, which is actually one of the most brilliant state papers ever written. The power of incorporation, Hamilton said, is inherent in the definition of government. Okay, it doesn't matter if it's in the Constitution or not. It's an inherent power. It's there. If the U.S. government has sovereign power, a sovereign government has all of the means necessary to attain the ends of power. If the government of the United States does not have this power, what we would have was the singular spectacle of a political society without sovereignty, or of a people governed without government. Now, as to this argument that none of the express powers of the Constitution give the Congress this power to charter a bank, it is not denied, Hamilton said, that there are implied as well as express powers, and that the former, that is, the implied powers, are as effectually delegated as the latter. There are also resulting powers, that is, powers which come as a result of the government exercising another power. For example, if the United States conquered a foreign territory, it would have sovereign jurisdiction over it, even though the Constitution doesn't say if you conquer foreign territory, you'll have jurisdiction over it. I mean, that's a resulting power. I don't think the Constitution says anything about conquering foreign territory at all, but that is a power a sovereign government has. Okay? And Hamilton goes on to say, if the end, that is, something we want to do, be clearly comprehended within any of the specified powers, and if the measure has an obvious relation to that end, and is not forbidden by any particular provision of the Constitution, it may safely be deemed to come within the compass of national authority. This is perhaps the most important statement ever made on constitutional interpretation, and it's one we'll be hearing quite a bit over the course of the semester. If the end be clearly comprehended within any of the specified powers, the measure has an obvious relation to that end, and is not forbidden by a particular provision of the Constitution, it may safely be deemed to come within the compass of national authority. It's actually a brilliant formulation, wrong as it may be. So you have an end that the Constitution envisions, uniform currency, legal tenders, the same throughout the country. This measure, the bank, does have an obvious relation to that. Nothing in the Constitution says you cannot charter a bank, right? No specific provision of the Constitution forbids it. Therefore, this end is constitutional. And then this other argument, the chartering of the bank abridges the pre-existing rights of the states or individuals. Does it do so? Well, no. States can still charter all the banks they want. If the chartering of the bank does not violate the rights of individuals, then it's constitutional. And it all hinges on what the word necessary means. Jefferson's definition of necessary, so Hamilton had said, this is all under the Congress shall have the power to make any laws which are necessary and proper to carry into effect the foregoing objects, okay? So, is this necessary? Well, it depends on what necessary means, which is exactly what Jefferson had said. But Hamilton says Jefferson was too limiting in his definition of necessary. Necessary means needful, requisite, incidental, useful, or conducive to. Right? What does necessary mean? Needed to complete a certain goal. Okay, so you would take more Jefferson's side then. Useful?
I disagree with useful being necessary.
Okay. Might help if you want something, though. Would be okay. Okay. So, what do you think? Who is more convincing, Hamilton or Jefferson? You say Hamilton. You're saying Jefferson, I think. You don't like his definition of necessary. Good question. What would you do if you're President Washington? You have one guy saying this is unconstitutional, another guy saying this is constitutional for these reasons. Excuse me. It's,
Like Hamilton, because he gave an example of where, like, people really need, like, implied power, and he's saying, well, I mean, there's going to be a time when we're going to need this at some point.
like when we need to conquer foreign territory or something like that? Yeah.
Or, you know, if we're dealing with, like an Indian being conquered by territory.
Okay. No, I can see that. Jefferson's Secretary of State. He knows that there are going to be things the government will need to do, but what is the point of having a written constitution if then we can say, well, this is a case where we really need to do something even though we don't have the power to do it? You had your hand up first, I think.
I agree with that, but I think it's what Jefferson is arguing is that by having the operative word being necessary, if you're saying that it's useful, that it sets a dangerous precedent by opening up to say what is useful, what is necessary
Right.
for future things.
So you would be on Jefferson's side? Okay. This lady first.
I think I would agree with Jefferson as well, partly because of his argument, but also partly because clearly, like from the beginning, before you get into the gray area, it really does violate the Constitution.
Okay.
Because it can't charter.
Okay. Yes, you like Hamilton, though.
Yes, it's not that I like Hamilton, but thinking on it, when somebody's legislating or interpreting, and they're using the too narrow definition, it put limits, especially when such a notion of sovereignty of the United States, the Confederation at that time, is still so really undefined. When they still have issues about, they need to define it so that they would be more credible for the international geopolitics and diplomacy, credible in front of the other governments, credible in their foreign policy, because they're already having to deal with the pirates. Problems in the Mediterranean, they have to deal with the British problems.
Sure. Well, sure. But the thing is about dealing with all of those problems is that's Jefferson's job. He understands these are problems, but do you simply say, let's give the government more power? And what's the purpose? I see what you're saying, and I see what Hamilton is saying. And the more I think about it, the more skeptical I become about giving a grant of power like this or letting Congress be the judge of how much power it will have. Yes?
Well, I would actually argue that, that in a sense they're both right. That Jefferson's right. That it it is a question of necessity.
Yeah.
My argument would be with Hamilton though that it is a necessity in order to achieve the coinage of money and for
Right.
taxes.
Okay.
You have to have uniform currency.
Okay. Yes.
I haven't meant giving Congress more power. I have meant of just drawing the lines better between what the powers of the executive and what the powers of Congress. And then, yes, it's coming into a question the powers of interpreting the Constitution.
Right.
And this is where some other independent branch, like the courts, would have to play. And this is where the courts would have to decide what.
But right now, it's not a question for the courts to decide, and no one's saying. And it is really not a question of does the president or Congress have this power. It's a question of the power of this government itself. And we know Congress can make the laws, and Article 1 sets out what kind of laws Congress can make. Yes.
Each of these
right.
Will balance each other out, and in this way guarantee the freedoms.
Well, right. That's why Washington was going to use his veto, because he saw that as a check on Congress violating the Constitution. By the way, this isn't the last we'll have to discuss a bank. Washington does sign the bank bill into law, accepting the notion that yes, the Congress can do this, even though the Constitution does not expressly say it can. This is part of a growing difference of opinion politically between Hamilton and Jefferson, or Hamilton more properly and Madison. And it's going to be a growing disagreement about this, but the real issue is not going to be so much the bank, although this is a symptom of it, as it's going to be the response to the French Revolution that politicizes everything. And every issue in the 1790s in America has some relationship to the revolution in France, which divides people's opinions as to whether the revolution in France is a good thing or a bad thing. It's tied in with a lot of other things we have discussed, the fear of excessive democracy, versus rule by the better sort of people. The French Revolution is one of these events that just resonates much more so than, the bank issue in many ways is what we today would call a beltway issue. It's of great concern in Philadelphia, maybe less concern out in the provinces. The whiskey tax is going to be an issue of great concern out in the provinces, as will be the French Revolution. And what you see here is the administration, really the folks whom we will call Federalists, although they are not a party in the sense we think of political parties, they pretty much are the guys who are in government. And opponents of the administration, who could be called anti-federalists, but probably are more properly called, Republicans, which is what they call themselves. But neither one says we're a party. Neither one has a national chairman and sends out mailings telling you to give them money and does the other things we expect political parties to do. Each sees itself as representing the people or representing opinion. And I don't know, you probably know more about the French Revolution than I do. And what happens in France is lots of these little debating clubs are set up, called Jacobin clubs and other things. And here in America, some people emulate these Jacobin clubs, setting up little debating societies, which they call Democratic Republican clubs, because they're Democratic Republicans. And they get together, they pass resolutions, and they often, too, publish newspapers. And you have, throughout this, in the cities of the country, as well as on the frontier, Democratic Republican clubs being set up and advocating liberty and these other things that some folks like. Hard to figure out how to put this clearly. Okay, let's just back up for a moment. The real event here for us, it also goes back to John Adams having time on his hands. And in 1790, he's presiding over the Senate. That's pretty much all he gets to do. And he's really worried about what's happening in France. Because what he sees happening in France is the breakdown of civil government in France, with the calling of the Estates General, and then the doing away with the monarchy, the aristocracy, these other institutions that the French have created to govern them, and you do away with these things, what's going to happen? And Adams had at hand a book written in the 16th century by an Italian historian named Davila on a civil war in France in the 15th century. And what had happened during this civil war in France was the established government had been torn down, ushering in a period of anarchy, and the period of anarchy ended with a military dictatorship. So Adams sees this is probably what's going to happen in France now, doing away with the established government, not having anything in its place. What you're going to do is open the way for military despotism, and that will be really bad. And Adams starts writing his Discourses on Davila, and published in a Philadelphia newspaper until a mob of Democratic Republicans goes down to the publisher's house, says, if you print any more of this stuff, we're going to smash the printing press, because we think the French Revolution is a pretty good thing. We like liberty, equality, fraternity. Those are the three things of the French Revolution. Does anyone here not like liberty, equality, and brotherhood? Okay, you don't like democracy either, so, okay. But most of us do. And here is John Adams, and what was he doing last year? He wanted us to call the president some ridiculous thing like his elective mightiness. He wears a sword to the Senate. He wants to establish an aristocracy here, which is why he doesn't like the French Revolution, because he spent all that time in England. He became a dupe of the British monarchy. He wants to be the Duke of Braintree. And so stop printing this stuff because he's crazy. Okay? Pretty much that was the tenor of their message to the publisher, who decided he wouldn't print any more of Adams's musings on 15th century France, because it would lead to the smashing of the printing press in 18th century Philadelphia. You have poor Adams writing his Discourses on Davila, and then you have, in England, Edmund Burke writing this pamphlet, Reflections on the Revolution in France. Has anyone read this, by the way? Yes. So what is Burke says pretty much the same thing. Yeah. Yeah, it's a critique of the French Revolution. You can't discard the government that's been created, and governments, Burke says, emerge out of the society, and you can't simply say, hey, we're tired of that government, let's create a new one with which we have no experience and expect it to work. The Reflections on the Revolution in France is a warning about creating a government that's inconsistent with your experience. It's going to lead to disaster. And Burke, yes? What? That's exactly what Thomas Paine says. Thomas Paine, at this point, is a member of the French Assembly. And he writes an attack on Burke called A Vindication of the Rights of Man. Because people have a fundamental right to change their governments, no matter what Edmund Burke thinks. Burke had been a great supporter of the American Revolution, but now he's attacking the French Revolution. What does he know? And so the vindication of the rights of men is a call for revolution against these stuffy conservatives. I'll use that term because that's what they were called. Tories like Burke and Adams, who don't see that history is not on their side, that people have the right to do this. Do you agree that people have a right? Do you think people have a right to change their government even? Or you're...
I do.
You do? Okay, good. Okay, good. So, Burke writes this really great critique of the French Revolution. Paine writes a brilliant attack on Burke and a defense of the French Revolution. And in the spring of 1791, a guy named John Beckley gets a copy of Paine's pamphlet. He's a functionary in Congress, and it's published over in Europe. Not many copies arrive here. Beckley gets one, and James Madison wants to read it. And so Beckley lends it to Madison. And Jefferson finds out that Madison has this hot book and asks if he can read it, and Madison says, well, I promised I would give it back to Beckley. I'm going to be leaving town. I wanted to give it back to him before I left. How about if I give it to you and then you give it to Beckley? So Jefferson's Secretary of State, right? So he's a guy you can trust to return a book. And so Madison gives him the copy. Jefferson reads it, and then actually Beckley has left town too. And the message to Jefferson then is, send this directly to the printer, Jonathan B. Smith, who is going to print an American edition of this. So Jefferson thinks this might be a little awkward because Smith doesn't know me. He's expecting to get the book from Beckley. He's going to wonder how come he's getting it from me. So Jefferson writes a little note. And it would have been nice enough to say, which Jefferson does, Mr. Beckley lent this to Mr. Madison. Mr. Madison lent it to me. Now I'm sending it to you. That would probably be enough for many of us. But Jefferson goes on. He always has to go on. I am extremely pleased, he wrote, to find it will be reprinted here, and that something is at length to be publicly said against the political heresies which have sprung up among us. I have no doubt our citizens will rally a second time to the standard of common sense. Right? Remember, common sense was Paine's pseudonym back in 1776. Now, Smith did not know Jefferson, but he knew how to sell books. And he knew this is a blurb. So this is on the title page of the book, the first American edition, that Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, says this is going to counter the political heresies which have sprung up among us. What do you think he means by that? Yes, people think, in fact, the newspapers which would not print Adams's discourses on Davila now start printing them side by side with excerpts from Paine showing which particular parts of Adams Paine is refuting. So you have essentially this argument going on between Paine and Burke over the French Revolution. Now you have an argument going on between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson using Paine and Burke as, counterweights here. So this is a great thing for political discourse. It's really a bad thing for the Washington administration because you have the Secretary of State in this public argument with the Vice President. And remember, Adams and Jefferson are very close friends. And this charge that Adams wants to be an aristocrat, he always finds a little ridiculous, particularly since the counter to that is Thomas Jefferson is the man of the people. How did that happen? Have you been to this guy's house? It's a strange thing happening here as Adams, Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton are all at odds with one another. And, Jefferson does write to Adams apologizing for it. We can get into this next week, okay? We'll leave you hanging. Yes?
Actually, at one point, Thomas Jefferson recognized that it was actually, he kind of meddled a little bit into the French politics when actually the droit de l'homme composed in his living room as the radicals.
Right, yeah.